Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. So today we're cracking open a piece of history that hits pretty close to home for those of us in anarchist circles. We are going to impartially examine a super intense but absolutely fascinating text, an excerpt from G.P. Maximov's The Guillotine at Work. Specifically, we'll be looking at his critique of how early Soviet policy translated Marxist theory into a system of state terror. Maximov, being a prominent anarcho-syndicalist, gives this highly critical, step-by-step breakdown of how a movement promising ultimate freedom ended up resulting in, well, ultimate centralization. Now, we aren't here to take political sides today. Rather, we're just going to unpack exactly how Maximov constructs his historical argument and follow his logic right from the drawing board.
To do that, we've got a really clear roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll look at the Marxist state blueprint. Second, a crucial distinction between enemies and adversaries. Third, the purging of political opposition. Fourth, the suppression of peasants and workers. And finally, what he calls the mechanics of terror. Okay, let's dive right in.
Section 1. The Marxist state blueprint and its foundational theories.
So, Maximov doesn't actually start with the chaos of the Russian Revolution itself. Nope, he digs way back into the foundational theories of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. He wants to show us that the extreme centralization of early Soviet state building wasn't just some historical accident or a reaction to the war. He argues it was baked right into the original plans. Take a listen to this quote from Friedrich Engels. He says, "Since our state is only a transitional institution, the proletariat still needs the state. He needs it not in the interests of freedom, but in order to be able to suppress his enemies." Maximov points to this specifically to argue that the state, according to its very founders, was explicitly designed for violent suppression, not immediate freedom. The whole concept of a free state was essentially nonsense to them as long as the state apparatus existed at all. Taking that foundational idea, Maximov introduces this really wild but vivid concept, the Marxist Louis XIV. You guys probably remember the French king Louis XIV, right? The ultimate symbol of absolute monarchy, the guy who famously said, "I am the state." Well, Maximov argues that taking Engels' blueprint of a state built for suppression and putting it into Vladimir Lenin's hands logically necessitated an absolutist dictator. Because Lenin defined the dictatorship of the proletariat as a power completely unbound by laws, Maximov asserts that it effectively concentrated all authority into this highly centralized autocratic structure. It's kind of shocking when you step back and think about it. A movement built entirely around proletarian liberation and overthrowing kings ultimately structures itself so that the party becomes the vanguard, the leader becomes the party, and ultimately one single ruler assumes the posture of an absolute monarch.
Moving on to Section 2, Enemies versus Adversaries and how they widen the net.
This brings us to a really crucial conceptual pivot in Maximov's text, defining exactly who this new absolutist state actually went after. Maximov notes that the state was built to suppress its enemies, which, were the expected old guard, capitalists, landlords, generals, priests. But, and here is the kicker, Maximov argues that Lenin expanded this mandate to include what he termed adversaries. And who exactly were these adversaries? Basically, anyone outside the ruling party. This meant independent thinkers, rival socialist groups, labor unions, cooperatives, and even the vast passive masses of the general public. By treating adversaries with the exact same level of hostility as outright enemies, the state created this ever-expanding net of targets. The human impact of this shift was just staggering. Suddenly, merely disagreeing with the party line or even just trying to live independently made you a target that had to be crushed.
Which leads us to Section 3, Purging Political Opposition and Eliminating Rivals.
Here, Maximov outlines how this whole theory of suppressing adversaries was practically and violently applied to rival political groups, just knocking them down one by one. Right off the bat, in December 1917, the Cadet Party representing the bourgeoisie was outlawed. Okay, maybe expected. But then the crosshairs moved decisively leftward. By April 1918, the anarchist movement was physically crushed by the state. By June 1918, the right social revolutionaries and social democrats were expelled from the Soviets and entirely outlawed. The definition of an enemy of the people was just expanding incredibly fast. It was rapidly sweeping up fellow leftists, organizers, and dedicated revolutionaries who simply didn't align 100% with the Bolsheviks.
And to explain how this purge of fellow leftists was justified, which is especially relevant for our movement, Maximov highlights this specific quote from Lenin. "Anarchism and anarcho-syndicalism are bourgeois movements, which are an irreconcilable contradiction to socialism, proletarian dictatorship, and communism." Just think about the profound irony there. The state was taking fellow socialists and anarchists, people who were fundamentally opposed to capitalism, and ideologically relabeling them as a petty bourgeois threat. By totally twisting the definitions, the state gave itself the theoretical justification for the violent military pogroms carried out against anarchist organizations in the spring of 1918.
But wait, it wasn't just anarchists. Maximov points out that even formerly allied parties weren't safe from this expanding net. The left social revolutionists actually shared power with the Bolsheviks initially. They were literal coalition partners. But, according to the text, the very moment they defied Lenin's policies, specifically by pushing back against the Brest-Litovsk peace agreement with Germany, they were ruthlessly suppressed. Almost overnight, former allies were relabeled as accomplices of the White Guardists and hirelings of the enemy. Loyalty to the state no longer meant loyalty to the revolution, it meant absolute, unquestioning submission to whatever direction the party chose.
Let's look at Section 4, Suppressing Workers. The ultimate irony of the whole situation.
This is where Maximov highlights the ultimate, really tragic irony of this entire system. Because this widening net, it didn't just catch political rivals. It eventually dragged down the very classes the revolution claimed to champion, fundamentally upending rural life. Maximov details a ruthless war declared on the Russian peasantry. The state's policy relied heavily on grain requisitions carried out by armed detachments, who just took grain from farmers indiscriminately. The government enforced fixed grain prices, while the actual currency was basically worthless, a policy Maximov bitterly calls ordinary plunder. When the state tried to use committees of poor peasants to enforce these extractions, it provoked massive, desperate rebellions all across the countryside. And when peasants, whether they were rich or poor, refused to give up their only source of food, they were collectively labeled as, you guessed it, enemies of the people.
Actually, it wasn't just the countryside. The paradox hit the urban workers squarely in the face, creating a horrifying reality for everyday laborers. In what was supposed to be a workers' state, the actual workers were aggressively silenced and persecuted. Maximov cites historical instances where factory workers who simply demanded better food provisioning, or those who just tried to preserve their independent workers' cooperatives, were suddenly branded as scoundrels bribed by the bourgeoisie. If a worker valued their hard-earned wages or just basic survival needs over the absolute dictates of the state, they were no longer seen as the core of the revolution. They were treated as an adversary to be eliminated.
So, what was the human cost of this continuously widening net? Well, it meant a massive, unprecedented sacrifice of civil rights. Entire foundations of a free society were completely dismantled. The population literally lost their freedom of the press and freedom of association. They lost freedom of conscience. They were stripped of the right to form independent labor unions, and even the fundamental right to strike. Freedom of thought and scientific inquiry were heavily policed, and the basic safety of a person in their own home was just erased. Maximov really emphasizes the sheer, devastating volume of everyday freedoms that were completely eradicated in this single-minded pursuit of centralizing power.
This deep ideological contradiction brings us to what I think is one of the most powerful and honestly damning quotes in Maximov's entire text. He writes, "The dictatorship of the proletariat is thus a slaveholder's democracy, enslaving the entire population for the sake of freeing and enfranchising it." This perfectly encapsulates the core thesis he's putting forward. The idea that a government can systematically terrorize its citizens, take away their basic autonomy, and force them into submission, all under the guise that this subjugation is somehow creating a free and enfranchised society, is just an absolute absurdity to him.
Finally, Section 5, the mechanics of terror and systematic subjugation. So how exactly does a state maintain this immense paradox? Maximov asserts that the implementation of terror wasn't an accident. It wasn't a tragic mistake or just a desperate reaction to wartime circumstances. No, it was a calculated, premeditated strategy. He argues that Lenin explicitly looked back to the Great French Revolution, fully believing that a successful revolution required Jacobin-style terror. You know, the same Jacobins who architected the bloody reign of terror in 1790s France. Lenin believed that to fundamentally reshape society, you had to actively prepare the masses for terror, psychologically conditioning them to accept state violence as a necessary, scientific tool of progress.
But here's where it gets even darker. Maximov notes that Lenin went a step further than the Jacobins. While the French Revolution used the guillotine to break active resistance, executing those who openly fought the government, what about passive resistance? What about the millions of people who just quietly refused to cooperate? Well, the new Marxist state broke passive resistance using the grain monopoly, bread cards, and the very real threat of starvation. Maximoff believes that this method, terror by starvation and the absolute monopolization of basic survival, was the ultimate unprecedented weapon of the new state. It was a completely inescapable form of control.
Maximoff anchors this pretty chilling claim using Lenin's own words, quoting, "Those means of control and compulsion to work are stronger than the laws of the convent and the guillotine. We have to break down passive resistance." According to the text, the state knowingly used universal forced labor and state-controlled food scarcity as systematic tools. It wasn't just about executing active enemies on a scaffold. It was about forcing the entire population into absolute subjugation by literally controlling their day-to-day ability to simply eat and survive.
As we wrap up today's explainer, I really want to leave you with the central, provocative question that Maximoff poses to his readers. I want you to truly pause and think about this for a second. Is it possible to arrive at freedom via enslavement, or the abolition of the state via its strengthening? Maximoff's answer, based on the historical record he lays out, is a resounding no. But it leaves us, the viewers, to ponder the profound historical consequences of using state terror and absolute centralized power to try and build a utopia. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope exploring these historical arguments help clarify a deeply complex piece of history for our community. See you next time.